Behind the walls of Arizona's death row sit killers whose crimes shocked entire communities. Family massacres, cold-blooded robberies, and betrayals that cut closer than anyone imagined. And now, with execution dates looming, the state is preparing to end their lives in the most final way possible. These are the crimes that sealed their fate and the execution methods that will carry out their sentence. Quick note before we dive in, timestamps are in the description so you can follow the stories in order or come back to the ones you want to hear again. Richard Kenneth Djerf, the Luna family massacre. They say revenge eats a man alive. But in Phoenix, 1993, Richard Kenneth Djerf decided that wasn't enough. He wanted everyone else to feel the burn of his hatred. And in the quiet home of the Luna family, he carried out one of the most horrifying acts Arizona has ever seen. It started with a grudge. Djerf believed the Luna family had betrayed him, and in his twisted logic, betrayal demanded blood. Neighbors would later recall seeing his car parked outside their home on an ordinary September day. Nobody could have guessed that inside those walls, a nightmare was unfolding. 4 lives, mother, father, teenage daughter, and a young son, were trapped with a man whose rage was boiling over. Djerf didn't rush. He controlled the scene like a puppeteer, using threats, weapons, and sheer terror to dominate the family. The details that later came out in court painted a chilling picture. He tied them up, taunted them, and one by one took their lives. For investigators, walking into that crime scene was like stepping into pure madness. Officers would later describe the house as eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your chest tighten. Family photos still hung on the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, while the living room was marked by the chaos of their final struggle. Detectives immediately knew this wasn't a random killing. It was too personal, too targeted, and before long, suspicion turned toward a man who had once been connected to the Lunas, Richard Djerf. When police tracked him down, they found the evidence stacking quickly. Witnesses, physical proof, his own connections to the family. Everything pointed straight to him. At trial, prosecutors laid out the story in brutal detail. The jury heard how Djerf meticulously planned his revenge, how he justified the killings in his own twisted mind, and how he seemed to relish the control he had in those final hours. The defense tried to raise questions about his mental state, but the sheer weight of the evidence crushed any chance of mercy. The verdict was swift. Guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder, the sentence death. But in America's justice system, a death sentence doesn't mean an immediate execution. For decades, Djerf remained on Arizona's death row, his name buried in appeals, legal filings, and motions that seemed endless. Every hearing was another wound reopened for the surviving friends and relatives of the Lunas. Each legal delay left them asking the same haunting question: how long must justice wait? Year after year, Djerf's case moved through the courts. His attorneys argued constitutional issues, claimed unfair procedures, raised questions of mental competency. But every time, the courts upheld the conviction and the sentence. By the mid-2020s, Djerf had run out of time. His appeals were exhausted. On August 19, 2025, the Arizona Supreme Court signed the final order, an execution warrant. The date was set, October 17, 2025. After more than 3 decades, the state would end what Djerf had started on that blood-soaked day in 1993. The method of execution: lethal injection. It's Arizona's default punishment, though some older inmates can choose the gas chamber. For Djerf, there's no choice left. When that date arrives, he will be led into the chamber at Arizona State Prison Complex, Florence, strapped to a gurney and injected with the state's deadly cocktail of drugs. And while his final hours are still ahead, the memory of what he took away will always linger. The Luna family was wiped out in one afternoon. Their lives, ordinary, hopeful, loving, ended because one man's anger outweighed their right to live. Friends remember Mrs. Luna as kind and generous, her husband as hardworking, the children as full of promise. That's the cruelest truth. Their stories ended far too soon. For Arizona, this case is more than just another execution on the calendar. It's a reminder of how justice can move painfully slow, and how the shadow of one man's violence can stretch across decades. Some see Djerf's scheduled execution as long overdue closure. Others see it as another life lost to violence, even if sanctioned by the state. But as the clock ticks toward October, one thing is certain. The name Richard Kenneth Djerf will once again echo through Arizona, not as a man seeking revenge, but as the condemned who finally ran out of time. And while his story nears its end, another death row inmate waits in the same shadows, one whose crimes weren't driven by revenge, but by a darker pattern that stretched across multiple victims. His trail of violence left entire communities living in fear, and soon, we'll step inside his story. Trent Christopher Benson, DNA-tied serial predator. In the mid-2000s, women in Mesa and Phoenix lived with a quiet fear. A predator was out there, one who stalked, lured, and killed with cold precision. His name was Trent Christopher Benson, and his crimes revealed a darkness that only DNA would eventually expose. Benson seemed, at first glance, unremarkable. A man blending into the Arizona suburbs, working jobs, moving through life like anyone else. But behind closed doors, he harbored a violent obsession that left a trail of trauma. Between 2004 and 2007, women began disappearing or turning up dead. Their cases marked by the same brutal pattern, sexual assault followed by murder. For years, investigators chased leads that went nowhere. Witnesses described vague encounters, but there was nothing solid to connect the dots. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything: DNA. At one crime scene after another, forensic teams recovered genetic evidence. Each sample led them closer to a single source. When Benson's DNA was finally matched, the pattern snapped into place like a puzzle. He wasn't just a suspect, he was the common thread behind multiple unsolved crimes. When detectives confronted him, the mask of ordinary life crumbled. Prosecutors described Benson as a serial predator who hunted women in bars, lured them under false pretenses, and then turned violent. He wasn't impulsive, he was calculated, patient, and merciless. The trial shook Arizona. Families of victims filled the courtroom, staring at the man who had destroyed their daughters, sisters, and friends. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA ties, victim testimonies from survivors, and the chilling consistency of his crimes. Benson's defense had little to counter with. By 2011, the jury had heard enough. He was sentenced to death. Since then, Benson has waited on Arizona's death row, his name sitting in legal filings while the appeals churn on. But unlike some inmates whose convictions remain in dispute, Benson's guilt is etched in genetic code. Every strand of DNA told the same story. He did it. Arizona's plan for him is clear. When the courts finally close his last appeal, Benson will face lethal injection. No choice, no alternative. The same state that once pieced together his crimes with science will now use science of another kind. The chemicals that will still his body forever. For the families of his victims, the wait for justice has been long. They've carried photographs, memories, and the ache of loss for nearly 2 decades. Some say no punishment can bring back what was stolen. Others believe only the finality of execution will balance the scale. And as Benson sits in his cell, the silence of death row grows heavier. He isn't scheduled yet, but time is catching up with him. Just as DNA once traced every step he took, the system now traces the final steps he'll face. But Benson's case is only part of Arizona's grim story. Another name on death row is tied to a massacre so bloody it stunned the entire city of Tucson. 6 victims in a single rampage. One man behind it all, and his path to execution is already paved. Scott Douglas Nordstrom, the Tucson Massacre. In 1996, 2 separate robberies in Tucson turned into massacres. By the end of the night, 6 people had been executed in cold blood. At the center of it all was one man, Scott Douglas Nordstrom. The first call came from Ying's Cafe, a small family-owned restaurant. Patrons were used to the comfort of familiar dishes, the warmth of community. But that evening, horror unfolded. Armed men stormed the cafe in what appeared to be a robbery. Within minutes, 2 employees were dead, gunned down execution style. Survivors would later recall the chaos. Chairs crashing, screams echoing, the sharp, deafening crack of gunshots bouncing off tiled walls. As Tucson police scrambled to understand what had happened, another call came in. Just a few miles away at the Firefighters Union Hall, gunmen struck again. This time, 4 people were killed, lined up, shot without mercy. It wasn't just a robbery anymore. It was a calculated massacre. The community reeled as word spread. In one night, Tucson lost 6 lives to senseless violence. Detectives began piecing together the puzzle. Witnesses gave descriptions, fragments of memory in the haze of shock. Ballistics linked the two crime scenes. The same type of weapon, the same brutal method. Whoever did this hadn't acted impulsively. They had a plan. Before long, the investigation pointed toward two men, Robert Jones and Scott Douglas Nordstrom. Jones, the alleged trigger man. Nordstrom, his partner in crime. Prosecutors would later describe Nordstrom as a man who knew exactly what was unfolding, who walked into those places not as an innocent bystander, but as an active participant in the bloodshed. The trials were harrowing. Family members of the victims filled the courtroom, clutching photos, fighting back tears as they listened to the gruesome details. Prosecutors painted a picture of greed and violence. Two men who decided that money was worth more than human lives. The defense tried to chip away at the narrative, arguing that Nordstrom hadn't pulled the trigger, that he wasn't the mastermind. But under Arizona law, it didn't matter. If you take part in a felony that leads to murder, you carry the weight of every life lost. The jury found him guilty. 6 murders, 6 stolen futures. In the late 1990s, Nordstrom was sentenced to death. His partner Robert Jones would be executed in 2013. For Nordstrom, though, the legal battles dragged on. He filed appeal after appeal, claiming errors in his trial, pointing to constitutional arguments, hoping for a lifeline. For years, it seemed as though his case would never end. But in 2023, the Arizona Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. The door slammed shut. He was now execution eligible, the state authorized to carry out his sentence. Today, Nordstrom sits on death row, waiting. His method of execution will be lethal injection. Decades have passed since the summer of 1996, but for the families of the 6 victims, time hasn't erased the pain. They remember the laughter that never returned, the birthdays missed, the children who grew up without parents. For them, the news of Nordstrom's appeals ending brought a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. Justice may finally come, but nothing can undo what was taken. What makes Nordstrom's case stand out isn't just the brutality of the crimes, it's the cold precision. 2 separate locations, hit in one night, 6 lives ended in less than an hour. It was violence not of impulse, but of intent. And that's why, all these years later, the case still haunts Tucson's memory. As his execution looms closer, the debate over capital punishment in Arizona continues. Some see Nordstrom's fate as overdue justice. Others argue the state should not take another life, no matter how guilty. But beyond the debates and the legal filings lies a simple, devastating truth. 6 families will forever carry the weight of that night. And Nordstrom, the man who once believed he could outrun justice, is now counting down the days he cannot escape. Yet death row in Arizona holds more than men like him. Among the names is one that reaches further back in time, a man known as the death row drifter, whose crimes in the 1970s shocked Phoenix and whose method of execution might come from another era altogether. His story is next. Joseph Clarence Smith Jr., the death row drifter. Phoenix, 1976. 2 teenage girls vanished, and when their bodies were discovered, the community recoiled in horror. The man responsible was Joseph Clarence Smith Jr., a drifter whose crimes were so disturbing that even hardened investigators struggled to describe them. Smith's victims were young girls, innocent, full of life, with futures ahead of them. In a time before DNA could crack cases wide open, detectives relied on grit, old-fashioned police work, and chilling eyewitness accounts. What they uncovered was almost too much to bear. Both girls had been tortured before their deaths. Investigators noted the brutality, the deliberate cruelty, and the way Smith seemed to take pleasure in their suffering. Phoenix police quickly realized they weren't looking at a man who had simply lost control. They were dealing with a predator. The case drew headlines across Arizona. Parents locked doors tighter, warned daughters not to walk alone, and feared that someone like Smith could be lurking just beyond the reach of a streetlight. When Smith was arrested, police described him as cold, detached, almost as if the horror of what he had done barely registered. He denied responsibility, but the evidence told another story. Witness testimony, forensic connections available at the time, and his own patterns of behavior all converged to reveal the truth. Joseph Clarence Smith was guilty of murdering 2 teenage girls. In 1977, a jury sentenced him to death. But that wasn't the end. Arizona's death penalty system was still evolving, and Smith's case became tangled in decades of appeals. Legal challenges about sentencing procedures, constitutional claims, and questions of fairness sent his case bouncing between state and federal courts. Each round kept him alive, year after year, while the families of his victims waited in limbo. Over time, Smith earned the nickname the Death Row Drifter. He had no stable ties, no strong community roots, and in the prison system he remained a shadow, known less for who he was than for the brutality of what he had done. His name would fade from public headlines, only to resurface when another appeal was denied. For nearly 50 years, his case lingered, a haunting reminder of how long justice can take. But now, the waiting is almost over. Smith's appeals are exhausted. The courts have said enough. He is execution eligible. And because his crimes predate Arizona's switch to lethal injection in 1992, Smith holds a rare choice. He can die by lethal injection, or he can opt for the gas chamber. The gas chamber. The very phrase sends chills through anyone who remembers its history. Arizona's chamber sits at Florence Prison, a relic from another era where cyanide pellets dropped into acid produce a cloud of lethal gas. It's a method so controversial, so tied to images of suffering, that most states abandoned it decades ago. Yet for Joseph Clarence Smith, it remains on the table. If his execution goes forward, it won't just be about one man's crimes. It will reopen Arizona's uneasy relationship with the death penalty, its slow-moving cases, its controversial methods, and its constant battle between justice and delay. For the families of the teenage girls, Smith's death may finally bring closure to wounds that never healed. For the state, it will mark the end of one of its longest-running death row sagas. And yet, even as Smith's story nears its conclusion, Arizona death row holds more names, each one carrying its own trail of pain. Among them is a man whose crime began with a home invasion in 1981. What happened inside that house would shock Pima County, and decades later, his name is still tied to the debate over whether justice ever truly balances the scales. Robert Lee Walden Jr., Home Invasion Horror. The year was 1981 in Pima County, Arizona. Robert Lee Walden Jr. forced his way into a woman's home and committed an act of violence so horrific that it still echoes through Arizona's courts more than 4 decades later. The crime began as a home invasion, sudden, violent, and uninvited. Walden wasn't just looking for money or valuables. What he wanted was control. Inside that home, he brutally raped and murdered the woman who lived there, leaving behind a crime scene drenched in terror. Neighbors recalled later how strange it was to see police cars and crime tape in a place that had always felt so safe. One moment, it was just another night in the desert. The next, it was a nightmare. Detectives quickly zeroed in on Walden. Evidence from the scene, witness accounts, and his own past history painted a grim picture. This wasn't a random act by a man who snapped under pressure. Prosecutors argued it was deliberate, cold, and calculated. A predator invading a sanctuary. At trial, the details were laid out piece by piece. Jurors heard the timeline, saw photographs, and listened to testimony that left the courtroom heavy with grief. For the victim's family, sitting through those proceedings was unbearable. They weren't just hearing about evidence, they were reliving the last moments of a loved one's life. When the verdict finally came down, guilty of rape and murder, there was no celebration. Only the quiet, exhausted relief that the man who destroyed their world would never walk free again. The sentence was death. Walden joined Arizona's death row, where he would spend decade after decade fighting his fate through the appeals process. Attorneys raised questions about trial fairness, about constitutional rights, about procedures and technicalities. Each attempt stretched the timeline further, but none erased the brutality of what had happened inside that house in 1981. By the 2020s, Walden had run out of options. His appeals were finished, his sentence stood, and like Joseph Clarence Smith before him, he now faces a choice unique to Arizona's older cases: lethal injection or the gas chamber. 2 methods, both final. The injection, seen as the modern face of capital punishment, or the chamber, a relic of a darker time where cyanide gas was once used to end lives in a way that many describe as haunting and inhumane. For Walden's victim's family, the years of waiting had been a punishment of their own. Every new filing, every hearing, every delay kept the wound open. Some hope his execution will bring closure. Others admit closure is impossible, that nothing will ever undo the violence he inflicted in those few, devastating minutes. Today, Walden remains on death row, one of the longest-serving inmates in Arizona's system. His name may not be as widely known as others, but in Pima County, the memory of his crime has never faded. When his day finally comes, the state will deliver justice in one of two ways, by needle or by gas. And yet, as chilling as his case is, Arizona's death row also holds stories of betrayal from within families themselves. One of them involves a woman who poisoned and beat her terminally ill husband, a case that shocked the state not only because of its brutality, but because it came from someone he trusted most. Her name stands out because she is one of the very few women awaiting execution in Arizona. Wendi Elizabeth Andriano, Poison and Betrayal, Phoenix, October 2000. A modest apartment, a marriage strained by illness, and a wife who claimed she was doing everything she could to care for her dying husband. But behind that facade, something darker was brewing. By the end of that month, Joe Andriano, a man battling terminal cancer, was dead. And his wife, Wendi Elizabeth Andriano, stood accused of poisoning and beating him in one of the most shocking cases of betrayal Arizona had ever seen. Joe had been fighting for his life. Chemotherapy, hospital visits, endless pain. Friends described him as quiet, humble, and still clinging to hope that he had more time left with his family. To those around them, Wendi seemed like the supportive spouse, a caregiver standing by her husband's side in his final days. But prosecutors would later argue that was all an act. Beneath the surface, they said, Wendi was frustrated, resentful, and already imagining a life without him. A life with freedom, money from life insurance, and no burden of illness tying her down. On the night of October 8th, paramedics were called to the Andriano home. They found Joe collapsed, unresponsive, his body battered, his system laced with sodium azide, a highly toxic chemical. At first, Wendi played the role of the panicked wife, crying and pleading for help. But investigators quickly noticed details that didn't add up. Why had she delayed calling 911? Why did she seem strangely calm in certain moments? And how had Joe ingested a poison almost impossible to acquire without deliberate intent? The autopsy told the story Joe himself no longer could. He had been poisoned, yes, but he had also been beaten, struck with such force that it was clear his death was not the slow passing of a cancer patient. It was violent, intentional, and deeply personal. The prosecution's theory was chilling. Wendi had grown tired of waiting for Joe's cancer to take him, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. Her trial in 2004 became front-page news. The image of a young woman, attractive, well-spoken, sitting at the defense table, while prosecutors described her as a cold-blooded killer, captivated the public. Some people asked how a wife could betray her husband so cruelly. Others wondered if stress and desperation had pushed her to a breaking point. But the evidence was relentless. The sodium azide purchase, the inconsistencies in her story, the brutal injuries on Joe's body. Jurors listened to days of testimony. Friends of Joe described his suffering, his fight to live. Medical experts explained how the poison coursed through his system, and how the beating ensured he stood no chance of survival. Wendi's defense tried to paint her as overwhelmed, a woman cracking under pressure. But the jury saw something else, a woman who had planned her husband's death. After just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. In 2004, Wendi Andriano joined Arizona's death row, one of the very few women in the state facing execution. For over 2 decades now, she has sat in Perryville Prison, her name etched into the short but haunting list of female death row inmates in America. Her method of execution will be lethal injection. There is no alternative for her, no gas chamber option, just the slow, clinical procedure that Arizona uses as its primary method of carrying out the ultimate punishment. For Joe's family, the case has always been about more than just justice. They remember a man whose last years were supposed to be filled with care and dignity, not betrayal and violence. They've carried the weight of knowing that the person who should have loved him most became the one who ended his life. And Wendy's story remains a reminder of how betrayal cuts deeper than almost anything else. It wasn't a stranger who killed Joe. It wasn't a robber, or a drifter, or a predator lurking in the night. It was the woman he trusted with his life. As she waits for the day when Arizona sets her execution date, the case of Wendi Andriano forces people to ask hard questions. How far can greed and desperation push someone? How much damage can betrayal inflict, not just on a victim, but on every life connected to them? And while her story is chilling enough, Arizona's death row holds yet another tale. This one of a man whose violence reached into 2 Phoenix homes in 1991, leaving behind scenes of terror and 2 lives stolen. His case would climb all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but in the end, his fate remained sealed. James Erin McKinney, double home invasion murderer. It was 1991 in Phoenix, Arizona. 2 separate nights behind the doors of 2 different houses, a calm night was shattered. The intruder was James Erin McKinney, and by the time he left, 2 people were dead. The first victim was Christine Mertens, a young woman living alone. Her home was supposed to be her sanctuary, the place where she could unwind, breathe, and feel safe. But safety was an illusion when McKinney forced his way inside. Armed with a knife, he attacked Christine in her bedroom. She fought, but the struggle ended in silence. Her body was later found lifeless, a crime scene that spoke volumes about the violence she endured in her last moments. Not long after, another Phoenix home was targeted. This time, it belonged to 65-year-old Jim McClain. McClain was a retiree, living quietly, enjoying the twilight of his life. But McKinney broke into his home too, searching for valuables. When Jim resisted, the violence was merciless. He was beaten and stabbed, left to die in the very place he should have been safest. 2 murders committed in cold blood, 2 families torn apart, and a city that suddenly felt much less secure. Police were under immense pressure to find the person responsible. Investigators connected the dots quickly: the method of entry, the brutality, the items stolen. Leads pointed to McKinney, a man already known to law enforcement. When detectives closed in, the pieces fell into place. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and his own admissions painted the picture clearly. McKinney was the killer. At trial, prosecutors described the crimes as calculated, not impulsive. McKinney had deliberately chosen homes, scoped out victims, and struck with the intent to take both property and lives. His defense tried to argue his troubled past, abuse, trauma, and mental health struggles. They argued he was more than the crimes he committed, that perhaps there was room for mercy. But the jury couldn't look past the brutality. 2 innocent people were dead. Their lives had been extinguished in places they should have been most secure. McKinney was sentenced to death in 1993. But unlike many death penalty cases, his didn't fade quietly into the background. For nearly 3 decades, his lawyers fought relentlessly, pushing his appeals through state and federal courts, arguing that his sentencing had been unfair. They claimed the trial court had failed to properly consider the evidence of his traumatic childhood and mental health issues. Evidence that, they said, could have swayed the sentence toward life instead of death. The legal battle dragged on, and at one point, it looked as though McKinney might escape execution. A federal appeals court sided with his defense, agreeing that his sentencing had been flawed. For a time, it appeared he could be resentenced. But the state of Arizona fought back, and the case rose all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 2020, the highest court in the nation delivered its decision. In a 5-4 ruling, the justices upheld McKinney's death sentence. The opinion was blunt. While his background was tragic, the facts of the crimes outweighed any mitigating circumstances. McKinney would remain on death row. His decades of appeals had ended in the same place they began, with the promise of execution. Today, McKinney's name is etched into Arizona's long list of condemned prisoners. He has exhausted his legal options. He is eligible for execution, and when the state calls his number, it will be by lethal injection. For the families of Christine Mertens and Jim McClain, the waiting has stretched across generations. They've lived through 3 decades of hearings, rulings, and headlines. Some of them have passed away without ever seeing justice carried out. Others continue to fight for closure, saying the only way to honor their loved ones is to finish what the courts decided long ago. McKinney's case is more than just the story of two murders. It's a mirror of the death penalty system itself. The long appeals, the tug of war between mercy and justice, and the endless years where families are forced to relive their worst nightmares in courtrooms. His story asks the question, how long should justice take? And what toll does that waiting take on everyone involved? As McKinney sits on death row, the desert sun rises and falls outside the prison walls, marking time that his victims never had. His life, extended by decades of legal battles, will one day end in the same sterile execution chamber where so many others before him have drawn their final breath. For some, it will be justice finally served. For others, it will be one more reminder that in Arizona, death comes not just from violence, but from the slow grind of the system itself. But McKinney is not the only name on Arizona's list. Another man waits, a man whose crime was a brutal takeover plot in Mojave County, where 3 lives were ended in one violent sweep. His path to death row was written in blood, and his story is one that still shocks those who remember it. Robert Allen Poyson, brutal triple-killing Mojave County, Arizona, 1996. In a desert town, one home became the stage for a crime so brutal, it still casts a shadow nearly 3 decades later. At the center of it was a young man named Robert Allen Poyson and his twisted plan to take over someone else's life by wiping out everyone who stood in his way. Poyson was just 19 when he fell in with 2 drifters. Together, they began plotting a violent scheme, kill the people inside a house and take it as their own. It wasn't about desperation. It wasn't survival. It was ambition warped into bloodlust. The home belonged to Letta Coggin and her teenage son, along with a friend staying with them. They were ordinary people, with routines, hopes, and trust. They had no idea the young man they welcomed into their lives was already planning their deaths. On the night of August 13, 1996, the plan moved from whispers to reality. The first victim was 15-year-old Roland Ware. He was attacked with a knife, bludgeoned with rocks, his throat slashed. The violence was excessive, savage, far beyond what was needed to end his life. It spoke to cruelty, to rage, to something inside Poyson and his accomplices that had no boundaries. Next came Letta, the mother. She was shot in the head, killed inside the very wall she had called home. And then, her friend, stabbed and beaten until there was nothing left to fight back with. 3 people, 3 lives extinguished in a single night, all so that Poyson and his companions could claim a house that wasn't theirs. When investigators arrived, the scene was unspeakable. Blood on the floors, signs of a struggle, the weight of silence pressing heavy in the air. Detectives pieced together the sequence of attacks, each more brutal than the last. The motive baffled even seasoned officers. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a fight that escalated. It was a deliberate decision to kill, to erase, to destroy. Police didn't have to look far for suspects. Witnesses connected Poyson to the victims. His movements, his associations, the very arrogance of his belief that he could simply take over a home, all pointed directly to him. He was arrested and the trial began. In court, prosecutors laid out the grim details. They told the jury about the rocks used as weapons, the knives, the bullets. They spoke about the planning, how Poyson and his partners had decided who would die and how. Jurors sat through photographs, autopsy reports, testimony that left the room heavy with sorrow. For the families of the victims, every word was agony. They weren't just listening to facts. They were reliving the night they lost everything. The defense tried to argue youth. They pointed to Poyson's age, to his troubled background, to the influence of the drifters he fell in with. They asked whether a 19-year-old deserved to die for mistakes fueled by others. But the jury saw more than a misguided teen. They saw a man who had made deliberate, violent choices. Choices that ended 3 lives and left an entire community shaken. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, death. Poyson joined Arizona's death row, his name etched alongside others whose crimes echoed with brutality. For years, his case wound through appeals. Lawyers raised questions about his sentencing, about whether his background had been properly considered, about the fairness of the process. But each appeal ended the same way. The courts upheld the conviction, upheld the death sentence, upheld the fact that 3 people had been murdered in cold blood. Today, Robert Allen Poyson's appeals are over. He is execution eligible. When Arizona carries out his sentence, it will be by lethal injection. The same sterile process used for others, but no procedure can erase the violence that brought him there. For the families of Lita, Roland, and their friend, the decades of waiting have been cruel. They've watched the legal system turn slowly, forcing them to sit through motions and rulings while the man who killed their loved ones continued to live, to breathe, to file papers. For them, justice has taken too long. But the end is now closer than ever. And when it comes, Arizona won't just be ending the life of Robert Poyson. It will be closing a chapter that began on a summer night in 1996, when 3 innocent people were slaughtered for a house. The story of Poyson is a reminder of how greed and violence can twist even the young into monsters. He was 19, barely an adult, yet he carried out crimes with a level of cruelty that shocked seasoned investigators. His case forces us to ask, what makes someone cross that line? And is justice delayed, still justice served? But Arizona's death row holds more than one story of betrayal and brutality. Among them is a man who lured a church volunteer into his home under the pretense of helping his family. What happened next turned an act of kindness into a crime that shook the faithful and left a community asking how trust could be turned into tragedy. John Edward Sansing, murder of a church volunteer. It was February 1998 in Phoenix, Arizona. A knock at the door of a church volunteer wasn't unusual. Help was often asked of the faithful. But when 36-year-old Trudy Calabrese offered her kindness, she couldn't have known it was a trap. On the other side of that request was John Edward Sansing, a man who would twist compassion into an opportunity for cruelty. Trudy was a woman of faith. Friends described her as generous, the kind of person who always found time to help. When Sansing called, claiming he needed food for his family, she didn't hesitate. She gathered church supplies and made her way to his modest Phoenix apartment, believing she was walking into a mission of service. What she didn't know was that Sansing wasn't seeking help. He was setting a stage for murder. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere quickly shifted. Sansing, fueled by drugs and desperation, overpowered Trudy. What began as a ruse turned into an assault, and in those walls of false hospitality, he brutally killed her. The exact details shocked investigators. She had been beaten and stabbed, her life stolen by the very man she believed she was helping. When Trudy didn't return home, friends grew worried. Calls went unanswered. Hours stretched into panic. Soon, Phoenix police were notified, and it wasn't long before they tracked her last known whereabouts to the Sansing residence. There, the truth came into the open. Evidence tied Sansing directly to the crime. Blood, witness accounts, and his own admissions made the case undeniable. For investigators hardened by years of violence, this case still cut deep. Trudy had been a symbol of kindness, a woman motivated by nothing more than the desire to help. To see her life end at the hands of someone who had preyed on that kindness left even seasoned detectives shaken. One officer later remarked, "She went there to give. He took everything." The trial was a painful process. Trudy's family sat in court, listening to every detail, reliving her final hours through forensic reports and testimony. Prosecutors painted Sansing as a manipulator, a man who lured his victim under false pretenses and unleashed unthinkable violence. The jury saw a man who had no regard for human life, no hesitation in exploiting trust. The defense tried to highlight Sansing's troubled background, his addiction, his state of mind, but the weight of the crime crushed any sympathy. In 1999, he was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury handed down the ultimate sentence, death. For years, Sansing filed appeals. His lawyers argued technical points, raised issues about sentencing, tried to find cracks in the state's case, but each time, the courts rejected them. In 2022, one of his last appeals was denied, sealing his fate. By the mid-2020s, he had exhausted every legal option. The state of Arizona was now free to schedule his execution. When that day comes, Sansing will be strapped to a gurney inside Florence Prison, the same place where Arizona carries its executions. His method will be lethal injection, a sterile, clinical end to a life marked by cruelty and betrayal. For Trudy's family, the waiting has been unbearable. They've endured more than 2 decades of delays, watching her name reappear in court documents and appeals, while the man who killed her remained alive. For them, the question has always been about more than punishment. It's about honoring the memory of a woman who lived for kindness and died because of it. The story of John Edward Sansing forces us to look at the fragility of trust, how one act of compassion, given freely, was twisted into tragedy. It reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with a snarl. Sometimes it comes wearing the face of need, waiting for someone's generosity to open the door. As Arizona prepares for the possibility of carrying out his execution, the echoes of 1998 still linger. Trudy's story is not just about her death, it's about the legacy of kindness she left behind, and the terrible cost of one man's choice to exploit it. For some, Sansing's execution will feel like long-delayed justice. For others, it will never be enough to balance the scales. But his chapter is nearly closed, and waiting in the same shadows of death row is another man, one whose weapon of choice wasn't poison or knives, but fire. His crime turned a Phoenix trailer into a blazing coffin, leaving a woman trapped inside. And for decades, he too has awaited the day when the state of Arizona will demand the final price. Leroy Dean McGill, firebombing death. It was the summer of 1994 in Phoenix, Arizona. In one quiet neighborhood, a different kind of fire was about to erupt, a fire born not of accident but of rage. That night, a homemade bomb tore through a trailer, flames consuming everything in seconds, and inside, a woman lost her life in a blaze she never saw coming. The man responsible was Leroy Dean McGill, and what happened that night would follow him all the way to death row. The story begins with anger. McGill was furious with the man who lived in that trailer, someone he believed had crossed him. In his mind, revenge wasn't a thought, it was a plan. He crafted a Molotov cocktail, a glass bottle filled with flammable liquid, a rag serving as the fuse. It was simple, crude, but devastatingly effective. Late at night, he crept toward the trailer, lit the rag, and hurled the firebomb through a window. Within seconds, flames exploded inside, turning the home into an inferno. But McGill's target wasn't the only one inside. Trapped within the fire was 29-year-old Deborah Debbie Braun, a woman who had nothing to do with McGill's grudge. She didn't even know him. As the fire roared, she couldn't escape. Witnesses described seeing the trailer swallowed by orange light, smoke pouring into the night sky, the air filled with the crackling of burning wood, the pop of shattering glass, and the desperate cries of neighbors who could do nothing but watch. Firefighters arrived quickly, but for Debbie, it was too late. The trailer collapsed around her, leaving behind only ashes and the weight of unanswered questions. Why her? Why such a cruel, indiscriminate act? Police and arson investigators pieced the story together. Traces of accelerant, the shattered remains of the bottle, and witness accounts pointed to McGill. It wasn't long before he was arrested. Confronted with the evidence, the story of that night unraveled. Prosecutors said McGill admitted to throwing the bomb, but what shocked everyone was his indifference. His real target had survived, yet an innocent woman had died, and still, McGill showed little remorse. At trial, jurors listened to the details with visible unease. They heard how Debbie's body was found, how the fire consumed her in minutes. Family members took the stand, describing her as warm, funny, and full of life. They painted a picture of a woman who didn't deserve the fate that found her, who became the victim of someone else's feud. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They portrayed McGill as a man who believed violence was the answer to any slight, a man who not only planned an attack but carried it out with full awareness that others might be hurt. The defense pointed to his troubled upbringing, to the chaos of his life before prison, to substance abuse that clouded his judgment, but the jury couldn't look past the flames, the death, the needless destruction. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, death. In 1995, McGill was sent to Arizona's death row, where he would remain for decades, his name caught in the endless cycle of appeals and legal challenges. Year after year, his attorneys filed motions, arguing over technicalities, over procedures, over the constitutionality of his sentence. But by the 2020s, every avenue had closed. McGill had no appeals left. He was execution eligible. Arizona's plan for him is straightforward: lethal injection. Unlike older inmates sentenced before 1992, McGill doesn't have the option of the gas chamber. His fate, when the warrant is signed, will play out on the gurney in Florence Prison, under the watchful eyes of guards, witnesses, and the families who've carried the burden of Debbie's loss for more than 30 years. For her loved ones, the decades have been agonizing. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary day has been a reminder that Debbie should still be here. They've watched McGill's name move in and out of the courts, his case debated, his sentence questioned. Meanwhile, they've had no appeals, no relief, no way to bring her back. The fire that McGill set in 1994 didn't just consume a trailer. It consumed futures. Debbie never got to grow older, never got to live the life that stretched out ahead of her. And the people who loved her have had to carry that empty space ever since. As his execution date approaches, McGill's story stands as one of senseless destruction. A man's anger bottled into fire took the life of a woman who had nothing to do with his feud. It's a reminder of how violence spreads like flames themselves. Once ignited, it destroys everything in its path. Some see his pending execution as justice long overdue. Others see it as one more act of state violence. But for the family of Deborah Braun, it is the only way the system can finally answer for what happened in that Phoenix trailer more than 3 decades ago. And while McGill waits in the shadows of death row, he is far from alone. Shawna Forde, the Arivaca home invasion murders, Arivaca, Arizona, May 30th, 2009. A tiny desert community, quiet, tucked away near the US-Mexico border, terror came crashing through the door of one small home, shattering the peace forever. It was a crime that left a father and his little girl dead, and at the heart of it was Shawna Forde, a woman who wrapped herself in politics and border militias, but whose thirst for violence went far beyond ideology. The victims were 29-year-old Raul Flores Jr. and his 9-year-old daughter, Brisenia. Raul's wife, Gina Gonzalez, would barely survive the ordeal. It was a massacre born not of random chance, but of a carefully orchestrated plan. Shawna Forde had been looking for money. She wasn't content with her role as the leader of a small anti-immigration vigilante group called Minutemen American Defense. To fund her group, she decided she needed cash. And in her twisted logic, that meant robbery. She told her followers that drug dealers would be easy targets. According to her plan, they would invade homes, steal drug money, and use it to bankroll her movement. But she miscalculated everything. On that May night, Forde and her crew, Jason Bush and Albert Gaxiola, stormed the Flores home. They wore camouflage and pretended to be law enforcement. They forced their way in, guns drawn, shouting commands. Raul Flores tried to reason, but it didn't matter. Shots were fired, hitting him multiple times, killing him in front of his family. Then the attackers turned their guns on the most innocent person in the room, 9-year-old Brisenia. The horror of her last moments still chills anyone who hears them. Brisenia begged for her life. "Why are you shooting my dad?" she reportedly asked, frightened but hopeful that her words might reach a shred of mercy. There was none. Jason Bush, acting on Forde's orders, pulled the trigger. She was executed on her own couch, next to her dying father. Gina Gonzalez, Raul's wife and Brisenia's mother, had also been shot. Wounded, bleeding, she played dead as the intruders ransacked the house. When they finally left, Gina found the strength to crawl to the phone and call 911. Her voice, captured on the emergency tape, was raw and frantic. "They shot my daughter, they shot my husband. Oh God, my daughter's dead." That recording would later become a crucial piece of evidence. Police quickly launched one of the most intensive investigations the area had ever seen. The brutality of the crime, the execution of a child, sparked outrage across Arizona and the nation. When detectives began pulling threads, Shawna Forde's name surfaced fast. She wasn't quiet about her militia activities. She'd bragged about planning operations, about needing funds. Witnesses came forward, telling investigators that she had spoken of robbing drug dealers to fuel her cause. Evidence mounted. Gina, who had survived against all odds, identified the intruders. Phone records, witness testimony, and physical evidence tied Forde and her crew directly to the murders. And when the case went to trial in 2011, the courtroom became a stage for one of the most shocking criminal stories Arizona had seen in years. Prosecutors painted Forde as the mastermind. She wasn't the one who pulled the trigger on Brisenia, but she had orchestrated everything: the plan, the home invasion, the cold-blooded violence. They described her as manipulative, dangerous, and utterly devoid of empathy. The defense tried to cast doubt to suggest that Forde was being blamed unfairly for the actions of her partners, but the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony that broke hearts came from Gina Gonzalez. In court, she recounted how she watched her husband die, how her daughter pleaded for her life, how she herself clung to consciousness. Her voice cracked as she told the jury what had happened that night. Few in the courtroom could hold back tears. When the jury returned with its decision, there was no hesitation, guilty on multiple counts of murder. And the sentence? Death. Shawna Forde was sent to Arizona's death row, becoming one of only a handful of women in the state to face execution. Since 2011, Forde has lived behind the walls of Perryville Prison. Her appeals, like so many others on death row, stretched on for years. She claimed ineffective counsel, raised constitutional arguments, sought to overturn her sentence. But one by one, those appeals failed. Today, she remains execution eligible. When her time comes, the method will be lethal injection. For the family of Raul and Brisenia, the years have been agonizing. Gina lives with physical scars from the bullets and emotional scars that will never fade. She carries the memory of her daughter's last words, the unimaginable weight of surviving what no mother should have to endure. For her, justice has always felt delayed. The story of Shawna Forde is a chilling reminder of how ideology can be twisted into violence, how someone can cloak cruelty in the language of politics or causes, when underneath it is greed, anger, and disregard for human life. It's also a reminder of the fragility of trust, because when armed strangers dressed as law enforcement entered the Flores home, the family thought they had no choice but to comply. That trust was shattered in blood. As her name sits on Arizona's short list of female death row inmates, one thing is certain: the shadow of her crime will never leave Arivaca. The community remembers, the state remembers, and most of all, the families remember. And yet, Forde is not the only woman in Arizona awaiting her turn with the executioner. Another sits in Perryville Prison, her crime committed not with guns and camouflage, but with a small, cruel box. Inside that box was a child, trapped and suffocated as punishment. And when the truth of that death came out, it horrified even seasoned prosecutors. Her name is Sammantha Allen, and her story is next. Sammantha Allen, the Footlocker murder. It was the middle of summer in Phoenix, July 2011. Inside a modest home on West Romley Avenue, the heat became more than just weather. It became a weapon. A little girl, just 10 years old, was locked inside a small plastic footlocker. Hours later, she was dead, and the people responsible weren't strangers, they were her own family. Her name was Erin. She was a playful, sweet child who loved to run and laugh. But Erin's life was different from other children her age. Neighbors noticed she was treated harshly. Punishments always seemed to fall harder on her than on the other kids in the house. She was singled out, blamed for things she didn't do, forced to sleep in odd places, and subjected to discipline that crossed the line into abuse. To the outside world, it might have looked like a strict household. To Erin, it was daily cruelty. On the night of July 12th, Erin was accused of taking a popsicle without permission. To most, it would have been a trivial thing, but in this house, it became a death sentence. Sammantha Allen and her husband, John Allen, decided that Erin needed to be punished. Their punishment wasn't grounding. It wasn't a scolding. It was a box, a plastic storage container meant for toys or clothes. They ordered Erin to climb inside. At first, Erin obeyed, sitting curled up in the cramped space. The lid was closed, but as the minutes stretched into hours, she shifted, trying to get comfortable. That wasn't allowed. Sammantha and John tightened their control. They padlocked the lid shut. Witnesses later testified that Erin begged to be let out. Her muffled voice carried through the plastic, pleading, crying, desperate for air. But no one opened the lid. The Arizona heat didn't ease, even at night. Inside that box, the air thinned. Her body temperature rose. Trapped and terrified, Erin's fight grew weaker until it stopped altogether. When the lid was finally lifted, she was motionless. The storage box had become her coffin. When police arrived, what they found was almost too horrific to process. A 10-year-old girl, dead in a container barely big enough to hold her. Detectives spoke later about the shock, about how seasoned officers were left shaken. They weren't just processing evidence. They were staring at the brutal truth of how a child had been tortured to death by her own family. The investigation peeled back the layers of Aim's short life. Testimonies revealed a pattern of abuse. She had been forced to eat hot sauce until she gagged, made to run barefoot outside as punishment, even locked in the box before. Only this time, she hadn't survived. Police arrested Sammantha and John Allen, charging them with murder. The trial that followed was nothing short of devastating. Prosecutors laid out the story with clinical detail: how the box was locked, how long Amin was left inside, how the heat and suffocation worked together to kill her. Jurors saw the footlocker itself, the padlocks, the evidence of deliberate cruelty. They heard about the other punishments Amy had endured, each one more disturbing than the last. Sammantha's defense tried to shift blame, suggesting she was under her husband's influence, that she hadn't truly meant for Aim to die. But the jury couldn't ignore the facts. She locked the box. She heard the cries. She walked away. That wasn't an accident. That was murder. In 2017, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. Sammantha Allen became one of just 3 women on Arizona's death row. For Amy's family members who loved her, the trial was agony. They sat through testimony about her last moments, about the fear she must have felt as the air ran out. One relative said afterward, she deserved love. She deserved a chance at life, and they took that from her. Since her conviction, Sammantha has lived at Perryville Prison, awaiting the slow crawl of the appeals process. Her method of execution, when the time comes, will be lethal injection. Unlike older inmates, she doesn't have the option of the gas chamber. For her, the end will come by needle. But no matter how or when the state carries out her sentence, Aim's story will never be forgotten. A child punished to death for something as small as a popsicle. A little girl whose short life became a symbol of how abuse, if unchecked, can end in tragedy. The case of Sammantha Allen forces us to confront a question that lingers long after the headlines fade. How could anyone look at a child begging for mercy and still walk away? For Arizona, her story is one of the most haunting chapters in its death penalty history. For the rest of us, it's a reminder of both cruelty and innocence. The cruelty that ended a life, and the innocence of a child who should still be here. And while Sammantha's fate is sealed, she is not the only woman whose name darkens the list of Arizona's condemned. Charles Michael Hedlund, the robbery-murder of Jim McClain in Phoenix, 1991. A robbery turned deadly, leaving a man named Jim McClain murdered in his own space. And the one held responsible for pulling the life out of that night was Charles Michael Hedlund. Jim McClain wasn't a headline before his death. He was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. Friends remembered him as private, steady, someone just trying to make ends meet. But to Hedlund and his brother, James McClain was a target. They believed he had cash in his house, something worth breaking in for. What began as greed soon spiraled into bloodshed. The brothers planned a string of robberies, casing homes, talking about easy money. When they reached McClain's house, the plan was simple: break in, take what they wanted, and disappear into the night. But once inside, things didn't stay simple. McClain was attacked, beaten, and stabbed. The details that surfaced later painted a scene of violence far greater than what was needed to steal. It was cruelty mixed with greed, and McClain paid the ultimate price. Detectives who arrived on scene found chaos, the signs of a struggle, blood spattered across the home. It didn't take long for suspicion to turn toward the Hedlund brothers. Witnesses tied them to the area, and the brothers' own behavior in the days after the crime drew even more attention. The pieces began to align: motive, opportunity, and the aftermath of guilt written in their actions. When the case went to trial, prosecutors made it clear this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was a calculated home invasion fueled by the desire for quick money, where human life became expendable. They told the jury about the planning, about how the brothers weren't stumbling into a crime but deliberately creating one. Charles, they argued, had made choices that ended with Jim McClain's body on the floor of his own home. The defense pushed back. They tried to paint Charles as someone caught up in his brother's orbit, a man with a difficult past, someone who didn't deserve the state's harshest penalty. They pointed to mitigating factors: his upbringing, his mental state, his potential for rehabilitation. but the evidence of his role in McClain's death was too heavy. The jury deliberated, weighing not only what Charles had done, but who he was when he did it. In the end, they returned with a verdict of guilty and sentenced him to death. His brother James received life in prison, but Charles was marked for execution. For decades, his case wound its way through the appeals system. Lawyers argued ineffective counsel, challenged evidence, and fought the sentencing procedures. Courts reviewed, revisited, and reweighed. But at every level, the outcome stayed the same. The conviction and death sentence stood. By the 2020s, Charles Michael Hedlund had no appeals left. His execution is now a matter of when, not if. When Arizona carries it out, it will be by lethal injection. The sterile process, the needle, the chemicals flowing through his veins, it will be a far quieter end than the one Jim McClain endured. For McClain's family, the decades since his murder have been filled with hearings, filings, and reminders of the night they lost him. They've had to watch as Charles lived on, even as their loved one's life remained frozen in 1991. For them, the justice system has moved too slowly, stretching out the pain of loss over years that never needed to be so long. Charles's story is not just one of crime and punishment. It's also about how choices ripple outward, how a plan for money turned into murder, how a single night created decades of grief, and how Arizona continues to wrestle with the weight of capital punishment. The murder of Jim McClain may not have made national headlines like other cases, but it remains carved into the history of Arizona's death row. It is a reminder that behind every condemned prisoner is a victim who should still be here, whose life was cut short by someone else's greed. And while Hedlund waits for the day the state calls his name, Arizona's list of the condemned stretches long, each name tied to a crime that left the state reeling. Thanks for watching. Click the cards on your screen to watch more death row videos.